Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The fluorescent lights in Fort Ironwood Supply Depot hummed like a tired engine as Jess leaned over a battered rifle scope she'd pulled from a crate marked for disposal, her sleeves rolled once and a pencil behind her ear, the desert dust still clinging to the edges of the metal housing. Outside, Nevada heat pressed against the cinderblock walls. Inside, the air was cool and smelled like oil, cardboard, and old paper. Jessica Coleman moved with a quiet rhythm, thumb on the focus ring, breath even, eyes narrowing at a fine hairline crack that anyone else would have tossed as junk. She didn't say much here and didn't have to. Paperwork flowed through her hands, requisitions found their way to the right shelves, and things that were lost had a habit of showing up when she checked the second time. Riley sat on a tilted chair a few feet away, balancing on two legs and chewing a sandwich, grinning at Cooper as if they'd just told the best joke in the world. "Quartermaster's digging for fossils again," he said through a mouthful, flicking crumbs off his sleeve. Cooper squinted from behind thin frames, clipboard tucked to his chest, more curious than cruel. Ruiz, older and broad-shouldered, parked his coffee on a stack of crates and gave a small snort. "If it doesn't plug into a laptop, private, it's ancient history," he said, but the way he watched Jess's hands gave him away. He'd seen careful hands before. Jess didn't bite. She angled the scope to catch the light, mapped the smoothness of the turrets, felt the weight distribution that told its own story. Not hobby store glass. Not a toy. Something that had been somewhere and done real work. She turned it over, searching the bottom seam, and paused when her fingertip felt shallow engraving beneath the grit. A draft slipped under the door as the corridor outside came alive with footsteps, clipped and measured, the kind you hear and straighten up for whether you mean to or not. Riley kept going, happy to perform. "Ma'am, we've got newer optics locked up that can do calculus for you. That thing probably loses zero if you sneeze." Cooper hedged. "To be fair, some older glass has character," he said, then pushed his glasses up and leaned closer. "What's the serial on that?" Jess said nothing, just breathed once, twice, and brushed the engraving clean with a cotton swab. She recognized the machining lines, the era, the way the adjustment detents clicked like they had an opinion. The room seemed to narrow, the way it always did right before something changed. Ruiz folded his arms. "Coleman, supply truck in an hour. If that's going to the scrap pallet, tag it now." Jess nodded without looking up. The footsteps stopped at the doorway. No announcement, just presence first, then the door eased wider, and Colonel Richard Holbrook stepped in with the kind of quiet that carried more weight than a shout. Silver hair, pressed uniform, desert dust on his boots same as the rest of them. Riley jerked his chair down to all fours so fast the sandwich hit the floor. Cooper tucked his clipboard behind his back and found a wall to lean on. Ruiz straightened, lifted his coffee, then thought better of it and set it aside. Holbrook's eyes scanned the racks, the orderly rows, the logbooks lined like bricks. They settled on the scope in Jess's hands. "Find something interesting, Sergeant?" he asked, mild, and Jess answered the way she always did around rank, steady and pared down. "Old scope, sir. Thought it deserved a look before we toss it." Holbrook held out a hand. She passed it over. He didn't fuss with it, he listened to it, the subtle grind that wasn't there, the integrity that was. He turned it in his palm, felt the heft, then rolled the body until the base faced the light. Jess watched his jaw shift almost imperceptibly when he found what she'd found. Riley leaned an inch too far forward. Cooper forgot to breathe. Ruiz's brow tightened, like a memory tugged at his sleeve. Holbrook didn't read the engraving aloud, not yet. He traced it once, then twice, then looked up at Jess, and whatever he was going to say got delayed by a radio burst from the hall and the soft clatter of a dolly hitting a doorframe. The moment stretched. Jess tucked her hands into her pockets and stared past Holbrook at the desert visible through the high, dust-fogged window, the flat line of horizon, the training range berms like low waves, the shimmer above the asphalt. She had come here for routine, for quiet work that began and ended each day in the same place. She had learned everyone's coffee order before she learned their first names. She filed the forms that kept the place alive. And still, the past had ways of finding you, even when you kept your head down and your words short. Holbrook finally spoke, voice low. "We'll talk in my office in 10, Coleman." No edge, no accusation. Just a decision already made. He offered the scope back with two hands, like returning a folded flag. Jess took it, set it on the mat where she'd been cleaning, and nodded. "Yes, sir." Riley's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Cooper found the courage to say, "Sir, is that," and stopped when Ruiz shot him a look that said not here. Holbrook's gaze swept the room one last time, noting the neat labels, the tools laid out in a straight line, the logbook open to today's page with clean block letters. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened for a breath. Then he turned and left, footsteps fading down the corridor. The door side shut. The humming light seemed louder again. Riley risked a whisper. "What was that?" Jess picked up the cotton swab and went back to work. The engraving waited, patient, like a door only she knew how to open. She wasn't ready to say the words out loud in front of these kids who still thought the world moved the way manuals told it to. She wiped once more, cleared the last stripe of dust, and the numbers looked back at her, sharp as the day they were cut. Outside, a dust devil crossed the motor pool and came apart against a Humvee. Inside, Jessica Coleman decided nothing just yet. She capped the solvent, closed the logbook, and told Ruiz the truck would be ready on time. And the truck was ready on time when Holbrook's call came through, crisp and plain, and Jess wiped her hands on a rag, locked the cage, and walked the corridor toward headquarters with the echo of her own boots reminding her there were places in this base where quiet did the talking. Nevada light poured through the narrow windows and laid hard stripes across the tile, dust hung in the air like a fine memory. She passed the motor pool, the briefing room door with its corkboard clutter of schedules and range rules, the vending machine that always swallowed dollar bills on Fridays, and then the corner office with the view of the drill field where the wind was forever undecided. She knocked, heard a calm enter, and stepped into a space that smelled faintly of paper and polish. Holbrook sat behind a clean desk with a topo map of the surrounding training area spread flat, a weather report folded under a ceramic paperweight, and a closed folder that had her name on the tab. He didn't gesture dramatically, just a small nod toward the chair. She sat, feet flat, hands loose on her knees, the way you do when you've learned that stillness is its own armor. The scope lay on his blotter, the engraving facing up like a line of text you can't unread once you've sounded it out in your head. He studied her for a beat that felt longer than it was. "We'll keep this simple," he said. "Tell me what you see when you look at that glass." Jess kept her eyes on the edge of the desk and let her voice do the work. "I see European machining from a time when tolerance wasn't a rumor. I see good glass that never asked permission to perform. I see where that says it was carried by someone who cleaned it on bad days and better ones." He waited. She added, "And I see numbers someone thought were important enough to cut into steel." Holbrook's mouth flattened, not unkind. He turned the scope with 2 fingers until the cut letters caught the window light. World record, 3,210 meters. Al Anbar Desert. The words didn't need the rest of the story, they dragged it behind them like a shadow. He slid the folder an inch closer to his elbow but didn't open it. "I read After Action once," he said, like he was remembering a newspaper headline that no one else had seen. "Odd winds by dawn, thermal shimmer by 9, target exposed for less than 20, exfil clean, credit withheld." Jess felt the years lean in. The office faded at the edges, no sound except a far-off mower and the tick of the AC, while her head filled with heat mirage and the chalk taste of dust and the long, slow count you do when you're either going to be a ghost or a gravity lesson. She cuffed the feeling away. "Sir, why am I here?" He didn't blink at the directness. "Because people follow examples more than orders," he said, then tapped the scope once, soft. "And you are either going to be an example they can stand on or a rumor they chase around the motor pool. We're spinning up an advanced marksmanship block. Small group. Controlled. Not a circus. I want you on it." There it was, plain as the desert. The thing she'd left behind knocking on her door with its hat in its hands like it had every right to come in. Jess drew a breath, felt the chair under her and the scar on her thumb she'd earned on a rusted latch at FOB Liberty, felt the old argument rise, what she could do versus what she could live with. "I'm useful here," she said, steady. "Supply stays running, training happens on time, people get what they need before they know they need it." Holbrook nodded as if she'd just confirmed his premise. "You are. And you'd be useful there. We can do both if we do it clean. 2 mornings a week. Range 12 when the wind is honest. Cooper and Riley were at your counter an hour ago asking what the letters might mean without asking it out loud. Ruiz knows more than he says. We shape the narrative or we let the narrative shape them." He finally cracked the folder, not for theatrics, just to make the paper real. Redactions blinked out like missing teeth. "No names," he said. "They don't need names. They need discipline, math, and the part of your head that knows when not to shoot. You teach that, you don't have to tell them where you learned it." Jess looked past him to the map. The training berms were little smiles of brown ink. The pencil circle around a sector where crosswinds got tricky. She could hear range control on the radio already, numbers turning into corrections, corrections into hits. Her chest tightened and eased, like a door on half-latched hinges. She pictured Riley on the lane, leaning too hard on tech, then missing when the weather lied. She pictured Cooper cataloging variables and forgetting to breathe. She pictured Ruiz pretending not to care while catching everything in the corner of his eye. Holbrook waited like a man who'd spent his career understanding that hurry and pressure are not the same thing. "You get to say no," he said. "I'm not your conscience. But this base is full of kids who think the world is a slide deck. You could give them wind and gravity instead." Jess rubbed her knuckles once, a habit she'd picked up somewhere between dawns. "If I do it," she said, "we keep it small. No cameras, no show, no names. They learn how to think, not how to pose with a rifle." "Agreed," he said immediately, which startled her more than a lecture would have. "And your supply chain doesn't suffer. I'll move bodies to your cage on teaching days. You set your syllabus. I sign the memos that keep people from getting clever." The weight in the room shifted. The scope on the blotter looked less like a relic and more like a tool again. She could feel the base breathing out beyond the glass, trucks reversing, someone laughing at something that wasn't funny, a crow walking the fence line like it owned stock options. She nodded once. 2 mornings. We reevaluate in a month. Holbrook closed the folder and stood, and when he offered his hand she stood too. His grip was dry, brief, and said everything he didn't. "Good," he said. "Range 12, first light tomorrow. I'll keep the roster quiet." He glanced at the scope. "And we'll put that in the arms room vault where rumors can't take selfies." She left the office with the feeling of a balance struck on a knife edge and followed the corridor back to the depot, where the air felt colder than before. Ruiz was waiting by the door, not blocking it, just existing near it like a question. "Truck made it," he said. Cooper double-counted the optics. Riley picked up the crumbs. Jess nodded, moved past him to the counter, signed a receipt, and slid the clipboard back. For a second she thought of saying nothing more and letting tomorrow arrive on its own feet. But he'd earned a sliver. "Range 12, dawn," she said. Ruiz didn't blink, didn't smile. "Copy," he said, like the simplest word could be a promise if you meant it. Behind them, Cooper pretended not to hover with a stack of forms. Riley tried to teach the vending machine what legal tender looked like. Jess reopened the logbook to today's page and wrote 2 clean lines, moved 1 scope to vault, training block scheduled. She capped the pen with a small click that sounded louder than it should have, and let the room settle around her like a coat that finally fit. Tomorrow could have its say. Tonight, she would lock the cage and, for the first time in a while, sleep without answering. An old radio in her head still cracked once before dawn, a brief burst of phantom traffic that fizzled as Jess laced her boots and stepped into the chill that always came right before the desert remembered it was supposed to be hot. Range 12 sat at the far edge of Fort Ironwood where the berms rose like low railroad cuts and the wind did whatever it wanted without asking permission. Holbrook was already there, hands in pockets, face turned to the breeze as if he were listening to a language most people never learned. Ruiz stood beside the tailgate of a pickup, quiet and steady, while Cooper checked a kestrel, lips moving as he translated numbers into adjustments. Riley jogged up late, apology half-formed, then died on his tongue when he saw how the morning held itself. No jokes, no clutter, just the work. Jess said a simple line: safety, fundamentals, expectations. "We're not making movies," she said. "We're making decisions. Rifles don't forgive lazy." She handed out dope cards with empty spaces for wind, temp, density, altitude. Cooper filled his like homework. Riley glanced at his phone as if an app might save him. Ruiz wrote slowly, each number owned. The wind slid left to right at 6, then 8, then back to 6, messing with cheap flags and expensive pride. Jess put them at 300 first, sight in and groups, no pressure. Riley leaned into the glass and tried to will the bullet to behave. The shot landed off to the 2 o'clock. He frowned, added a click he didn't need, missed the other side. Cooper waited an extra beat on the trigger press and printed a tidy cluster that made him too happy too fast. Ruiz shot a small, patient nod and said nothing. Jess corrected softly, a finger on the data, a reminder on breathing. No speeches. They moved to 600. Mirage began to dance low, the kind that lies to you if you stare at it too long. Cooper called it wavy distortion, like a lab note. Riley said it looked like a road frying in July. Jess nodded once. Good. Don't fight it. Read it. She walked the line, heard the little tells, a breath cut too short, a shoulder lifting, a bolt run with nerves instead of flow. She adjusted hands, shifted elbows, said 3 words to Ruiz and none to Riley for a whole minute until the kid stopped chasing his reticle and let the rifle settle. Holbrook stayed behind them, silent mass, the kind of presence you forget until you need it. At 800 the wind picked up a mean streak. Cooper's first-round miss was wide. He reopened his kestrel like it had made a promise and then realized he'd fat-fingered a value 2 entries back. Jess nodded when he owned it, then gave him a hold that felt wrong to his eyes and right to the math. He broke the shot, waited the long half-second, and grinned when steel rang low and true. Riley tried to copy the hold without writing it down, hit dirt, then sand, then finally plate when he stopped cribbing and started thinking. Ruiz made corrections like he was moving furniture, quiet, inevitable, until his plate chimed on a rhythm. Jess watched them learn and felt the split in her chest again, the one that could widen if she wasn't careful. A gust hit from quartering right, dirty and inconsistent. She smelled the grit and, without meaning to, slid a fraction back in time. Al-Anbar came in on that same gust, low morning sun, a ladder of rocks under her ribs, the valley breathing heat, a 19-second window that would close if a single choice was wrong. She saw a pen mark on her notebook from that day, the simple note she'd made because complicated notes get you killed: trust the second band. She blinked and range 12 returned. Cooper looked up like he'd felt the temperature of her attention change. "You good, Sarge?" he asked, not loud. Jess set it down like a tool. "I'm good," she said, then set them at 1,000 even though they weren't ready, because some things you only learn when your old assumptions slide off like loose paint. She talked them through it slow, 9/10 wind left, a skosh for spin drift, a click for temp shift. Riley whispered, skosh, and Ruiz snorted, which broke something tight in all of them and made the next minute easier. The first volley was ugly. Steele stayed quiet and the berm applauded with dust. Jess didn't flinch. Reset, she said. Wind's got teeth. What do you owe it? Cooper recalculated, shoulders lower now. Riley asked a real question about mirage angles instead of a performative one about gear. Ruiz offered nothing except an example. The second volley found metal, one low edge from Cooper, one center from Ruiz, none from Riley. Then Holbrook stepped closer and said his first words of the morning. We stopped there, he said. Not a scold, not a threat. Just a wall that kept pride from overreaching. He looked at Jess. She looked back and understood, teach the head, not the distance. She brought them into the shade and ran a small board talk, not more than 5 minutes. You don't get paid for your last shot, she said. You get paid for your next correction. Write what mattered. If your page is empty, you didn't learn. Cooper wrote like a court reporter. Riley stared at the white space and then began to fill it, not with screenshots, not with swagger, but with a wind note and a line about waiting a half beat longer at break. Ruiz sketched a tiny diagram that would make sense only to him. Holbrook drifted away, phone to ear, the kind of call you make when you're moving resources without making a parade. When they went live again, Jess did something she hadn't planned. She set Riley at 700 with a modest crosswind and gave him an optic that wasn't his, older glass with a clean reticle and no crutch features. He looked skeptical until he saw the image and realized the clarity was the point. No training wheels, she said. Give the wind what it owns. He missed, then breathed, then corrected, then hit, and when he lowered his head from the stock he looked less like a kid wearing a uniform and more like a soldier finding a lane. Cooper closed the morning by calling Ruiz's wind for him without being asked, got it nearly right, took the correction like a small punch he deserved, and then nailed the follow-up. Jess called cold range and let the quiet land. They policed brass, logged rounds, reset steel. The sun climbed to its rude self. She felt tired in a way that wasn't all bad. On the walk back to the trucks, Cooper fell into step. When you said, trust the second band, what did you mean? He asked, casual voice failing to hide how much he wanted the answer. She didn't tell him about a ridge half a world away. She pointed at a low strip of mirage that ran contrary to the higher current. That one, she said. Up close lies more than far. Second band was truer today. He nodded like she'd handed him a key. Riley lagged behind, then caught up. Ma'am, he said, swallowing a little pride with the dust, thanks for making me write it down. You'll need it more than the picture in your head, she said. Ruiz didn't say anything until they reached the tailgate, and then he said, good block, which from him was a medal. By noon the range was a heat plate, by 1 the logbook had new lines, and by 2 Jess was back at the cage, where things stayed simple and labels pointed what they named. She stacked a box, signed a form, and glanced at the scope tucked away in the vault, out of rumor's reach but not out of mind. The day had gone the way it needed to, not because she'd chased distance, but because they'd learned to stop chasing ghosts. She shut her eyes for a second against the cool metal of the cage door and heard nothing in her head but the present tense, steady and plain, and when she opened them she knew tomorrow's work would ask for more of the same and then it asked for something else when range 12 woke up mean under a brown sky and the wind started switching lanes like a driver cutting traffic. Jess had them on a tighter plan, confirm zeros quick, jump to 700 for wind work, finish with a controlled 900 to push their heads, not their egos. Holbrook showed early, no words, just that habit of reading air like a brief he'd seen before. Ruiz laid out the kit. Cooper ran checks with the Kestrel and a notebook already half full. Riley looked steady, not cocky, which was new and earned him a short nod. The first half hour went clean until it didn't. A remote target actuator on lane 5 hiccuped, stuttered, then cycled wrong, leaving a heavy steel swinger frozen halfway between safe and live. Not catastrophic, just annoying, until the lane cam blinked out in the control box through a fault none of them had seen. Jess called cold range, flagged the lane, and started the boring safety protocol you do 10,000 times so the one time it counts you aren't guessing. She was halfway through the checklist when a gust rolled off the flat strong enough to lift grit and shove it under their eyelids. Dust devil broke across the berms. Someone downrange from another unit called a cease on the radio in a voice that didn't like surprises. Then the day put its hand on her shoulder. A short convoy of visiting brass picked that moment to swing by the range road, windows up, AC on, curious eyes doing a slow pass. Holbrook glanced at them once and went back to his business. Jess kept her focus on the failed actuator. Lane 5's target wasn't just frozen, the latch assembly had chewed out a pin and left the plate sitting wrong on its pivot. She could lock out the lane and move on, no drama. Except the plate was hanging high enough that if the wind caught the edge and rocked it at the wrong second, it could flash movement into someone's scope and drag a shot onto a problem. The conservative move was shut down, wait for range maintenance, lose the block. The right move was fix it fast and clean so the day didn't collapse into a briefing slide about delays. She keyed her radio, asked range control for a downrange window, got it, then turned to the line. Nobody touches a thing until I say so, she said. We're cold. Eyes on me, not the road show. Cooper and Riley nodded like they understood this was school getting real. Ruiz fell in beside her with a simple, I've got your 6. They moved in, slow and obvious, flags high, hands empty until they were under the plate. The wind tried to shove them. Jess leaned the way you learn to lean on roofs and ridgelines. Up close, the damage was plain, a bent pin, a chewed bushing, and a bracket that had started to wallow out its holes. Not a field weld, not without time they didn't have. Jess wrestled the plate to dead hang while Ruiz fished a spare pin and caught her from a small parts pouch. The grit cut across their teeth. She said, on my call, and he slid the pin as she lifted, shoulders talking back. The plate seated with a clean clunk that felt like a door latching. She set the cotter, tugged twice, checked sight lines, and stepped them out, deliberate and visible. Back on the line, Holbrook gave the smallest chin drop that said proceed. Jess brought it hot in stages, safety blocks first, then glass checks. The convoy had turned around at the far end and parked at a respectful distance. You could feel eyes but not hear them. She slid them into a drill she hadn't planned, reduced targets at 500 with uncertain wind, force calls, force corrections. It settled the room. Cooper took a clean first hit, then wrote down why. Riley missed low, held the correction, then got 2 in a row. Ruiz ran like a metronome. Then the second shoe dropped. Cooper's optic, one of the newer digitals, threw an error midstream, froze the display, and rebooted into a default 0 like it had decided to be born again. He caught it, pulled his head, breathing tight. Glass just died, he said, alarm contained but there. Riley looked like a kid who'd watched a teacher faint. Jess moved to Cooper's shoulder and saw the same fault she'd seen overseas in heat when firmware decided it hated physics. She didn't waste 5 minutes chasing menus with company reps watching from a truck. Off, she said. Run it dumb. She had Ruiz hand over the old-school backup they'd brought exactly for this. Cooper said it, breathed once like he was stepping onto cold pavement, and went back to basics. Your last good dope before the crash, she said. Write it. Now factor how hot this line got in the last 20. Give me a hold you can defend. He did the math, not perfect but honest. The next shot broke with less worry and more work. Steele answered, late and clear. Riley asked, what if it crashes on a real op? Jess didn't look away from the glass. Then you shoot anyway, or you don't. Gear fails. Decisions don't. The wind shifted hard, quartering left now, no longer playful. Lane flags were lying and the Mirage was running in 2 directions. She watched a minute longer than comfort, then called a move she kept for days that wanted to write their own rules. Hands off rifles, she said. Eyes up. Read the second and third bands only. First band is noise. Call me the hold that gets you center on a man size at 7. Cooper fought his instinct to quote his kestrel and actually looked. Riley's eyes finally learned to layer distances. Ruiz called a number that matched Jess's gut within a tenth. There it is, she said, and pointed them back down. 1 round each. If you miss, you owe me why. Ruiz hit first. Cooper hit with a touch of favor to the wind. Riley missed a hair right, but the correction came quick and clean and the second shot sang steel. A gust rolled another dust devil downrange and smacked the berm like a flat hand. The convoy windows cracked a few inches, then closed when the grit hit their paint. Holbrook stepped up just enough to stand beside Jess without crowding her space. We can shut it down and hold the day, he said, no pressure in it. Jess measured the air, the room, the faces. She'd already made the big decision, take the training, step back into this lane, so the small ones were just follow-ons. We finished the block, she said. Short and controlled. He nodded and stayed put. She pushed them to 900 with a reduced plate and strict time, 1 minute to build, 1 to break. No second tries. It wasn't drama, it was discipline under a clock. Cooper built a solid position fast, made a small wind error, and corrected in the minute he had left, catching the plate's left edge before time. Riley fought the timer, got rattled, and then did something Jess had been hammering for 2 mornings, he reset his breathing instead of muscling the trigger. He broke clean at 59 and the plate answered like a doorbell. Ruiz finished like he started, unbothered by the clock, the wind, or the idea that anyone might be looking. Jess called cold range, safed the line, and let the heat take back the ground. The convoy pulled away without fanfare. Holbrook didn't say nice job or good show, he just looked at the repaired lane 5, then at Cooper's backup optic, then at the notes in Jess's hand. We'll get maintenance to change that bracket out before next block, he said. You just bought them a day they couldn't buy themselves. Jess nodded, throat dry, not from dust. She had walked them right up to a line framed by weather and gear failure and then walked them back without anyone needing a story to explain it. On the haul back to the trucks, Riley fell in. I thought today was going to be about distance, he said. It was, Jess said. Just not the kind you brag about. Cooper lifted the dead digital in his hand like a lesson. Guess the old glass gets to talk after all. Old glass always talks, Ruiz said, climbing onto the tailgate. Question is if you listen. They logged rounds, stowed steel, and posted a red tag on lane 5 so maintenance couldn't pretend not to see it. Jess signed the range sheet and felt the kind of tired that lets you stand up taller. Back at the cage, she wrote the day into the book, not flowery, just the facts, actuator failure corrected, optic fault mitigated, wind lesson absorbed, block completed without injury. She closed it with a small click and looked at the vault where the engraved scope sat in the dark. The bass outside sounded like chow and traffic and 1,000 small things moving the way they're supposed to. Inside, her pulse finally let go of the throttle. She locked the cage and, for the first time in longer than she'd admit, smiled at nothing in particular, because the worst part hadn't been the wind or the gear, it had been the choice to step onto the lane again, and she'd made it, stayed inside the lines, and given tomorrow something better to inherit. Not as a parade but as a base that ran smoother than it had the day before, with range 12 tagged green by 0900, lane 5 sporting a new bracket that didn't chew its own hardware, and a memo from Holbrook stamped quiet that locked in the hybrid deal they'd shaken hands on, 2 mornings a week instructor, the rest of the time the quartermaster who made the machine hum. He kept it small like he'd promised, no headshots on the intranet, no quotes on the newsletter, just a line item on a training schedule that most people skimmed unless their name was on it. Jess felt the change first in the cage. 2 privates from Motor Pool were reassigned to her on training mornings, quick studies who'd learned in a day what to stock by weight and what to stock by reach, and that if you label a bin wrong here you might as well mislabel a compass. Ruiz started showing up at her counter 15 minutes early on range days without saying why, sipping coffee and letting silence do the checking in. Cooper kept his kestrel but started looking at the air before he let it talk him into a number. He'd bring her a notebook page after each block, not to brag but to verify, like a mechanic asking if the rattle he hears is the one you meant him to hear. Riley, who could fill a room with noise a week ago, now filled the space around his rifle with discipline. He still cracked jokes on the walk back, but not on the line, and he'd begun to catch himself when his shoulders climbed his neck. The rumor mill, which had tried to spin up after the convoy's drive-by, never got out of first gear. Holbrook made sure of that with 2 emails that looked like weather notes and a 3-minute talk at staff call about enforcing training privacy that made the gossip switch targets. The old scope stayed in the vault, checked out only once when Holbrook wanted to see if the armorer could confirm what his hands already knew, then back behind steel, because some stories work better as lessons than as exhibits. In the afternoons Jess went back to receipts and pallets and the small chest that kept a base from pretending chaos was normal. She found herself moving through the depot with a pace that wasn't avoidance anymore. The work was still quiet and still mattered, but now it fed the morning instead of hiding from it. When Holbrook called her in for a short debrief at week's end, it wasn't a performance review, it was 3 questions he cared about. Did the class size feel right? Were the lanes calibrated for next cycle? Did she have what she needed? She told him yes, and a request for one more set of wind flags that didn't lie when the first band did. He nodded, signed, and slid a slip across the desk authorizing her to draw from a budget pot that usually waited for quarterlies. Your name won't be on any board, he said, but the next unit that trains here will leave steadier than they arrived. That's the point. She found a smile she didn't have to hide and left with the slip folded in her breast pocket like a secret that didn't hurt. Out on the drill field, the wind carried the smell of cut grass and hot diesel. Somebody somewhere fired blanks for a rehearsal and the echoes sounded like 2 doors closing in sequence. In the break room, Riley handed her a paper cup and, without ceremony, asked if he could shadow the cage on non-range days to understand how the front end and the firing line were the same problem with different nouns. She said yes and set him to learning the difference between inventory and ownership. Cooper started a small habit of catching Ruiz after blocks and asking him to call wind for one shot while Cooper worked the rifle, then switching roles, a practice that ironed out ego faster than a lecture. Ruiz didn't change much, didn't need to. What did change was how he'd tilt his head when Jess spoke, like a man turning one ear toward the thing he'd decided was worth hearing. On Friday the range log ran clean, the supply ledger balanced without overtime, and Holbrook stopped by the depot door at 1700 with his cap in his hand and said, "Only, good week," which from him was heavy currency. She closed the cage and let the building cool behind her, walked the long edge of the motor pool where shadows got tall, and felt the old radio in her head stay quiet through a whole minute of nothing but boots on concrete. Back at her quarters she set her alarm for later than dawn for the first Saturday in months, then sat on the edge of her bed with the window cracked to the dry evening and let her hands be still. She was not a ghost here and not a headline, she was a sergeant and a quartermaster and an instructor who drew straight lines between the 3. The base would wake tomorrow without her on the range, and nothing about that felt like a failure, it felt like a plan doing what a plan should do. When she went back Monday, she knew exactly what she'd change: 1 sequence order on the 700 lane, 5 seconds off the build time to force better prep, a new way to explain why the second band tells the truth when the first one taps your shoulder and lies. For now, she let the week settle in her like a clean meal after a stretch of rations. Somewhere in the dark a freight train painted its slow line across town. On the fence near her window a small metal tag clinked against wire as the wind shifted, and in the vault across base, behind a door no rumor could open, a piece of glass slept that used to be a burden and had become a boundary marker, useful precisely because it stayed where it belonged. The old glass slept in the vault while the base woke to another Monday that didn't know or need its history, and that was the point Jess carried with her as she keyed into the depot and let the lights come up 1 row at a time. The week rolled in steady, inventory checks that landed where they should, a training block set for 2 mornings, Holbrook's short nod at staff call, the wind already tugging at the flag like it couldn't wait to interfere. On the line, Cooper had a new habit of pausing just long enough to read the second band without looking like he was praying. Riley logged his holds before he talked them, which made his talking worth more. Ruiz never changed tone but now and then said, "Good," under his breath when someone earned it. Jess kept the drills clean and the corrections blunt. She didn't chase distances for the sake of numbers, didn't feed the appetite for a stunt. She taught what she meant to teach: the next correction is your job, the rest is noise. By midweek, Range 12 felt less like a proving ground and more like a classroom with steel accents. Holbrook watched from the margin, leaving her space, calling maintenance before she had to, moving small pieces where they needed to go so the big picture didn't wobble. After Thursday's block he asked her, not ordered, if she wanted to expand the roster by 2 next month, and she said yes with a condition: pair every new shooter with a notebook, not a buddy. They could make friends later, first they had to write the truth. He agreed, penciled it into a calendar that never got sent to anyone who didn't need it, and walked off into the Nevada glare that bounced off his collar like lake water. Friday afternoon came with a quiet pocket of time Jess hadn't seen in a while. She used it to sign the last receipt, tag 2 crates for redistribution, and slip out the side gate with a pass that said she was on errand when really she was on repair. Carter Family Dojo sat 30 minutes up the highway where the brown gave way to a stand of stubborn pines and a strip of old storefronts. The floor was clean because she'd left it that way last time. The air held dust motes and the faint smell of wood oil. She pulled the tarp off the heavy bag, checked the stitching on a pad that always tore where it took the worst hits, and swept because sweeping was a thing you could finish in one go. She didn't train hard, she just moved enough to feel where her balance lived now. On the wall, a photo of a younger her looked back without accusation. She nodded to it like you do to a neighbor you used to know and turned off the light. Back at Fort Ironwood, the sun went down in a flat orange line and the motor pool clanged itself quiet. She slept without the old radio checking in. The next morning didn't need her on the range, so she let herself be a quartermaster only, signed for a shipment that would have been late if she hadn't walked it from the gate, fixed a scanner that ate barcodes, found a lost torque wrench under a pile of microfiber because things hide where you'd hide if you were small. Riley showed up off schedule and asked for 30 minutes in the cage to see how the labels and the lanes were the same system. She gave him the bin map and watched something click that wasn't about rifles at all. He left saying he'd stop treating checklists like penalties. Cooper brought her a page with a mistake at the top and the fix below it, circled in plain pen. "I want to remember I was wrong first," he said, and she told him that would save him more shots than pride ever would. Ruiz didn't bring anything except a spare cup of coffee and a look that said keep going. Holbrook dropped by with 2 sentences about a visiting unit. They wanted to sit in on a block. He told them no because privacy wasn't a favor, it was policy. Jess answered with a simple thanks and went back to the ledger. She didn't need a speech to know what that covered. By week's end the base felt like a clock that someone had finally leveled. The tick wasn't louder, just true. She stood in the depot door at 1700 and let the last of the light run the floor like water, thought about the first morning with the engraving under her thumb and how small the room had felt then, like a corridor that narrowed until you had to turn sideways. It wasn't narrow now. It wasn't wide either. It was enough. The lesson she wrote into herself was simple and not pretty enough for a poster. You don't get to hide from what you can do, but you don't have to let it run the whole show. Use it where it counts, put it away when it doesn't. On Sunday she went to the range alone, not to shoot but to walk the lanes and read the air like a page in a book she could finally set down. She checked lane 5 out of reflex. The bracket was still solid, the pin seated the way a pin should, the red tag long gone because the problem was actually solved. She looked downrange and thought briefly of another field half a world away where a bad morning had required a perfect shot and left her with a name she refused to carry out loud. She didn't owe that ridge anything now. She owed these lanes clear rules, honest wind work, and paperwork that didn't lie. She gave them that. When she locked the cage that night, she wrote one last line in the book for the week: block complete, lessons retained, inventory true. She underlined true, not because anyone else would read it, but because she wanted to see it again when the next Monday tried to pretend it had invented problems. In the vault the scope stayed behind its door, not a trophy, not a secret, just a piece of work that had done its job already. Maybe one day she'd sign for it and take it out to teach a point about clarity that wasn't about brand names. Maybe she wouldn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the people who said her name now said it to hand her a tool, not a spotlight. Holbrook would keep the promises he'd made because that was how he was built. Ruiz would keep showing up early. Cooper would keep listening before calculating. Riley would keep writing before talking. And Jess would keep drawing the same line until it held: teach the head, steady the hands, run the shop, read the wind, then go home. The story they'd tell later, if they told one at all, wouldn't be about a record carved into steel. It would be about a bass that ran better because someone chose to do 2 hard jobs the plain way without asking the room to clap. That was enough. She shut off the lights and stepped into the kind of dark that doesn't press on you, it just sits nearby and lets you pass.